Welcome to Spiritual Studies Session 51. This session is focusing on not a religion, but a theme of various religions, especially modern religions. This being asceticism, and then late in this session, the commentary on its antithetical nature in hedonism. Asceticism, defined as practicing rigorous self-denial as a religious exercise. So the question is, where does this come from? And if we follow the verbiage, it goes back to the Greek, aesthetikos, which means self-disciplined or laborious. The ascetes were monks, hermits, or even earlier than that, known as a skilled worker or somebody who practices a trade. This could even go so far as to consider it simply an athlete, one who exercised. Now, when we're applying it to its later iteration in what we now call aesthetic or asceticism, then we find it with the Stoics, controlling their appetites and passions in seeking virtue. And this subsequently picked up by early Christians. So in time, we see that it is very strongly associated with religious devotion. Those who desert the world and choose to live solitary lives in meditation, various other practices. So what is an aesthetic? In our contemporary understanding of this philosophy, this way, this lifestyle, it's one who shuts out the world in seeking spirituality or in seeking revelation or salvation or peace or happiness, depending on what tradition we're talking about. This is controlling your sensual impulses, your wants, an abstinence from carnal pleasures, a shutting out of the seeming enjoyment of the world in pursuit of purification of the body. The idea that accepting these whims, that undertaking these things, is diluting the purity of the body. And in order to stabilize the mind, in order to center yourself, you must abstain. And only through this could you reach contemplation of the deity and things greater. So where does this come from? Now that I've set the idea. And although it might proceed even further, a good starting point is talking about Hinduism, because there was a time in history between 1000 BC and 6000 or 600 BC. Oof, that's a big one. Span of 400 years where the philosophy of asceticism created concepts such as karma, maya, prakti, and yoga. Yes, you heard it right. Yoga from asceticism, controlling. And this is a mark of Hinduism, this core philosophy as we modernly look at it. But there was a time before this, and these traditions of the Vedic traditions, the Vedic rituals, would eventually come to be perceived as hollow or lacking of something. And this lacking led to a rise of asceticism, or the inward looking. But we'll get back to that in a bit. So names that go along with aesthetics. This could be a rishi. This could be a yogi. This could be a sadhu, a samyasi, a muni. This all just depends on what tradition you're looking at. These names are of different types of practices, all of them with the same rule of asceticism. This is not exclusive to men. However, historically, it would seem to be exclusive to men when you see depictions of aesthetics. When considering the yoga lead, the yogis, the yogic practices, the meditative practices, this leads to different tantric and esoteric methods. There are a variety of different groups, some of which open themselves up publicly, allow for an open forum, more or less, allow for any and all to come and learn. And then there are more secretive ones that would only allow you to enter through a trusted member or through the teacher. They mostly would do so to avoid certain scrutinies as to their methods, the harshing of certain cultural taboos. We've seen this with various secret societies throughout the course. So outside of that, this asceticism playing a very coined role throughout Hinduism and a significant motivator behind what we now associate with Hinduism, and that the many philosophical, metaphysical intricacies found throughout the Upanishads and onward can be traced to this inward looking of the aesthetics. So instead of going through, if you can imagine, here you are, someone who wishes to reach the more ultimate truths of a religion, of the world. And what you've been handed are ceremonies that seem to be devoid, classic preacher collects the money but doesn't give substance kind of ordeal. And so you notice within yourself and in this movement, this inward journey, call it whatever you'd like, meditation, yoga, astral projection, honing in on the chakras, what have you. But in this isolation, in this stillness, there is a realm of ideas of knowing that can propagate. And this is what would create subsequent religion, subsequent doctrine. This internalization, this controlling of the mind and body is really the central lead that I want to point to. If you do yoga, right, it's about these prescribed movements, these movements that strengthen certain proportions distinctly. And one does yoga or one does meditation or any of these methods listed in pursuit of a purity. I mean, that might seem like a bit of a leap, but it's true. I mean, if you were to do yoga or exercise, what are you trying to do? You're trying to feel more comfortable in your body as a most mundane explanation. And so this focus of the outer sacrificed for the inner is a trope which is very significant to spirituality, as opposed to looking outward into the infinite expanse of the cosmos, the macrocosm, to realize instead by the old Hermetic principle that it also exists within the microcosm, and that much more can be discerned if you first look inward to know yourself. So these divinities, these gods, these energies, these chakras, all these things that come out are from within. And I think that's an interesting lead to think on. That all of this is done with the goal of self-realization. All a matter of where you put your perception. So this natural reaction from empty ritualism to inward journey in the birth of the philosophy of asceticism seems all well and good. And as we trace this tradition as it spans, we'll see how it goes beyond that. But at first, it's worthy to note that it is an attempt to lessen human suffering, lessen wrong fixation on concepts such as death and disease. And this power of this initial concept has much to be spoken of. So by the time Alexander arrives in India from Greece, right? He's not taking interest in these old rituals. He's taking interest in these hermits, in these ascetics that live in the forests that have something very different to say, a quiet wisdom to them, a curiosity even. And so with this observation of Alexander and its bleed back into Greece, not to mention any other influences in the mess that was history, we can now take this conversation back to Greece in the very word aesthetic, right? So as noted, this is most pertinently seen in the Stoics of the ancient Greek tradition, this ascesis, the training of the mind and the body, the will against sensual pleasure. The control of emotions by reason is the doctrine of Stoicism. So your lower desires, right? So say you're chasing, how do I put this? Romanticism, let's put it that way. That would be preoccupying yourself with things away from ideals, away from virtues. This is not intelligent per se. Teach their own, but hey, this is the Stoic philosophy. That if you can get past these lower desires, then your mind can seek knowledge. And we see this in Plato. We see this quoted by Plato. To suppress bodily desires, to seek knowledge. That which is beyond. To question the whole pattern. And subsequently, this would move on to Neoplatonism. So I've asked this a few times about the Greeks throughout the course, and I'll say it again. Where did they get this from, right? They are inheritors of many traditions. In this case, we see exactly where they're getting this from. That the true glory and the true nature of mankind in a certain way is to go beyond the whims, to be able to discipline yourself. This is why the word aesthetic means discipline. To know yourself well enough to know the pitfalls you could fall into, and to turn those down in pursuit of something else, an ideal. And we see this with other aspects of control and other influences, say in the Orphics, as mentioned in the course before, their rejection of meat, or the same with Pythagoreans, you know, this strictly vegetarian diet playing into that hand in a light way. And we see this with Muslims as well in fasting. I mean, there's a lead there. Why the fasting? Where is that coming from? We see this with Christianity in the 40 days before Easter in Lent. Why the fasting? Well, to control the bodily desires in pursuit of something higher. And so with that transition, in consideration of early Christianity, you have these early fathers, these hermits who lived in the desert. And what did they practice? Well, they practiced a very strict self-denial. And by all these early church fathers, some of the most notable would preach strict rules for controlling your desires. And by the way, is this not getting some Buddhism vibes? We'll get to that later. The interesting lead here is this strong preoccupation, as it came to be had, with Christianity and celibacy. That in these early Christian communities, you would only become a member of the church if you were celibate. Pure, you see. And this isn't alone in Christianity. You also see this with the Aztecs. And in this early time too, you see some competitiveness between the Manichaeans and Christians in regards to this aesthetic pursuit, the level of poverty and celibacy required. So where in the Bible can we dig for reference to this? So let's first go to Peter 2:11. Beloved, I urge you as sojourners and exiles to abstain from the passions of the flesh, which wage war against your soul. Very, very upfront on that one. Or maybe we look to Romans 7:18 to 25. And I'm summarizing it here. Wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this body of death? Thanks be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself serve the law of God with my mind, but with my flesh I serve the law of sin. So, outright, the contention between Christianity, the Gnostics, and Manichaeans, right? So right here in Romans, we're hearing a direct reference to say that the body is sin. And as we know by the Gnostics and as we know by the Manichaeans, their whole thing was centered around that matter, the physical world, was created in wrong of some kind. If it's the Gnostics, then it was the demiurge or what have you. And the Christians would not sit well with these people. Although we're seeing their same note sung. So essentially, asceticism, inherited through Hinduism and found throughout the ancient world in this way, is the heart of monasticism, is the heart of what it meant to be a monk. Isolating oneself from society to focus on God. Now, if we were Hindu, then the focus would be on what? What do you want to call it? The dissolve of Maya, the devas, what have you, right? To pull away from society, to seek something greater, to pull away from sensation, to go inward. Now, the focus has changed depending on what tradition we're talking about, but the idea remains: controlling yourself through celibacy, obedience to something, minimalistic living. And the other mention here is that this has a strong tie to cynicism. Now, if you look up Diogenes, you'll note that Diogenes, while partaking in many sensual things, lived a life of minimalism, which is not far from the monasticism that we're seeing here, of eating very little, of only using a bowl. Diogenes saw a boy drinking from a river with his hands, and he threw away his bowl. To live with as little as possible, to have one pair of clothes, simple clothes, to eat plain food. But to the monastics, the extra addition would be to take a vow of silence. And we still see this today with the Amish. In Amish communities, you can understand the separation from society as a reverberation of the philosophy of asceticism, to deny the worldly desires, to deny the subsequent modern superfluousness. So you can see a different combination of doctrines here, right? I mentioned Gnosticism, Manichaeanism, and in Christianity, we see that it's kind of vacuuming up these various things throughout. Um, but it never went head first, it would seem. These early fathers played the part, but if you look at the Waldensians, if you look at the Cathars, both of which were genocided out of existence by the power structure of the Church of Christianity, they both practiced minimalistic, secluded, aesthetic lifestyles. They were very peaceful and inward people. But this eventually, as we've noted, would be a threat to what the church has become. So here's the convolutedness of history I'm trying to give out here. But I don't want to say too quickly, because not all Gnostics were aesthetics. The philosophy of living within the evilness of matter itself led to two different conclusions. One was aestheticism, and the other was a certain hedonism, that if it didn't matter, you might as well do all that you can while you're here, which again is something that we're going to touch on later. And the other philosophy here that we could talk about is sophistry. And that is that, and this is something very deep knit in us, culturally speaking, and philosophically and religiously speaking, that the highest thing to seek is the greatest a man can be, what is called civic excellence. So, what more can you aspire to in life than to be a supremely good person? To be measured, to be considerate, to be able to discipline yourself, to be earnest, sincere, but not foreboding and not conceited, right? So, what would it take to become these things? And it would seem that this discipline is a part of that journey. Here's another quote from the Bible, Corinthians 1:9. For this reason, we also, since the day we heard it, do not cease to pray to you and to ask that you might be filled with the knowledge of his will in all wisdom and spiritual understanding. So, what is that saying? That's saying, the supreme attribute is to be filled with the wisdom and spiritual understanding. Now, the question is only, what is the means? And part of this controversy between these various faiths and Christianity could be viewed in a quote from Corinthians as well, from 2:16. Let no one judge you, or actually 2:16. There is no reason to keep the Sabbath or holy days. So this is a hedging, because in respect to the Cathars, the Waldensians, the Christians would feast, and the Christians would live a lifestyle that wasn't purely aesthetic. And so this pushing away of the importance of the Sabbath and holy days was a way of protecting that lifestyle. So we can see that, and I've said it before, the Bible is a political statement in many, many, many ways. It's a political move, and it's a justifying move in this respect. So while there might be controversy in this, it is true to say that early on and throughout Christianity's whole reign, this influence of asceticism is strong. And how strong is it is what we're going to entertain now. So in this competition with the Manichaeans, it's this thing in asceticism where I will be more spiritual than you. As Alan Watts puts it, it's called spiritual one-upmanship. So I can make myself suffer more than you in the pursuit of fulfillment, in the pursuit of God, what have you, right? So they would go so far as to tie ropes around themselves so that they would be hung up in awkward positions so that they couldn't sleep properly. They would go so far as to condemn personal hygiene. That's why aesthetics are frequently seen with very long hair and with raggedy clothes. Washing would be the sin. This wild abandonment to grow fingernails to disgusting lengths and to reek and to lock yourself away in closed rooms for extended times, or to lock yourself away from society in derelict conditions of very little food, of very little nutrients. And as people are familiar with this, leading to self-flagellation, or self-flagellation, where they're whipping themselves. You see this depicted all the time. And where this is coming from is a story of itself, because it does go back way beyond monotheism. In a certain time, this was to drive out evil spirits. So you're going to do it yourself. You're going to drive out these evil spirits yourself by use of the whip. And then the other way, and in the same respect, this is purification. But in another way of looking at it, this is sadism, To purify myself, I need to whip myself harder. This is a type of lunacy, it would seem, right? And this would be performed as punishment at certain times and as part of certain rituals, depending. But you have this trope of, again, purification, which is, yet again, the root of the beginning of asceticism. So when the Black Death comes around, the plague rolls, what happens? Well, in order to get rid of themselves of the divine judgment, in order to rid themselves of the pain and the judgment and the punishment that would ensue, they would whip themselves to make the pain happen themselves, to take it into their own hands, to do self-torture instead of universe torture, which bled into a type of absurdity, right? Because then you have like this invention of different chains and girdles and devices placing around the feet, the hands, the neck of castrating yourself, of whipping yourself, of lacerating yourself. So this is what I'm talking about when I mentioned where this goes wrong, right? Because this is breeding extremism, you know? The inward journey has gone far beyond and has in itself turned into a strange sadistic ritual. And that's just one way of interpreting it, you know? I don't mean to hand it off like I'm getting it all in a bag, but then you look over at Japan, at these groups of Japanese Buddhism, the Tendai, the Shingon, where they took this same road of extreme asceticism, where they would wake themselves up in the middle of night and put themselves under cold waterfalls. So you barely any sleep, put yourself in the cold, being just beaten by a waterfall, and they would eat pine needles and resins and seeds alone, and got so good at denying themselves every bodily thing that they managed to perfect a process known as self-mummification. So Kashin Butsu. And you can see pictures of this to this day. They're very well preserved, as if they're still alive. But Buddhism doesn't follow this to a T at all. This is just certain groups of Buddhists. Because the Buddhist, or the Buddha, the story of the Buddha, involves Siddhartha being an ascetic and then reaching nirvana and realizing that asceticism isn't the way. That the liberation or the nirvana is reached by the trope that Buddhism uses, the middle way. So what is the middle? The middle would be between hedonism and asceticism. But again, we'll get to that in a bit. So to reject both paths and to develop the wisdom and knowledge of reality that is between the two, between control and discipline and the lack thereof, the living of life per se, between attachments and false views. But there are practices within Buddhism that use asceticism to put you in the right place. Now, there's very little argument that is needed to be had when it comes to the modern age being very compulsive, being very away from asceticism, right? And it's interesting to say that too, because you still have these sexual taboos brought in by Puritan and Christian culturalism throughout Europe and the Western world, where these sexual taboos are brought in by the tropes set by monasticism and asceticism. There's still the guilt that's brought along with it, even though in the modern day we are very far from believing in asceticism. So there's some incongruency to mull your mind over there, but I'm getting off the point. So the word I'm not going to attempt to say because we know how good I am at that. I think it's a duta. Okay, so Dhuta. And then you add an NGAS. And there are 13 of these renunciations within a teaching of Buddhism, the 13 renunciations of reducing your attachments. So again, this isn't the whole thing, but this is a way of simplifying. This is a way of going inward. This is a way of setting your priorities straight. This is a way of disciplining yourself. These 13 renunciations. And so if you reduce your needs, you appreciate the little things more, right? I mean, that's a good philosophy for anybody. And that would pull you away from what others would call sin, right? Pride, greed, gluttony. And that this is well on your way to being a great person or reaching nirvana or liberation, alignment, right? So these would be for anybody. These renunciations would be a practice for anybody. It's not for just those of the chosen. And why would somebody put themselves through this? Well, again, what is the thing that you seek? Do you seek to become mature? Do you seek to become better perceptible? Do you seek to become fair? Do you seek to become gracious, grateful, humble? Well, here are things to assist. So I'm not going through all of these. I'm not teaching Buddhism here, but I'm making a point through all of these. So some of these practices would be something to the effect of eating a single meal a day. Now, what does that do? Well, it has you control your appetite. Again, there's the discipline, and it has you appreciate that meal that you do have. One of these calls for you to remain for an extended length around the dead. So in the graveyard, now what would that do to you? Well, if you spend a lot of time there, just imagine the contemplation that you could have. Imagine the solidarity that you could feel, and imagine the perspective that you could get from that, to kind of face the mortality of it and to realize who you are in this moment there, you know? Another one pays very well to that aesthetic tradition, and that is to abandon your robes. That's not to go full naked, but it's like minimalism, where you get rid of all these non-essentials. Do you really need that whole closet? Do you really need all that? How many pairs do you need, right? How much do you really need? I mean, to what point are you keeping up appearances, right? And also, what is that practice of keeping up appearances? What's up with that? What if you strip that away? What would be left? These are the kind of questions to be asked, right? In regards to that former food question too, there comes one of these that says to not accept any more food than what is within the bowl. So although you might have hunger, still beyond having that one meal, to say no. Because it's control, you see, that you have the power to say no to that appetite, that you're in control of this ship, and that it's not in control of you. And what would that do? And again, I make the argument that you can take this entirely too far, but what would that do, you see, in right proportion? And then, of course, one of these is to remain in the forest, to stay there for a good while, to stay there. And what would that do to you? What if you stayed in one forest, right? Or traveled throughout for a solid 3 days or whatever, just a good amount of time. You see these people that do like the Pacific Crest Trail and whatnot, Why do they do that? What's up with that? What's up with all these people, these hikers, What are they on about? Nature, You go check it out for yourself. These are different ways of, well, you're kind of making yourself do it, you know? You're making yourself do it to prove to yourself that you can and to see what it's all about. These are the different disciplines. They're renunciations because you're saying no to something very substantially and very convincingly. So what would these different renunciations do, right? So it could improve various attributes that you wish to see in yourself, right? So oftentimes we think that we can fix problems by bringing more in, right? We need something to fix this. We need something more in our life, a new gizmo, an app to tell us what to do, whatever, a new teaching, that we need more in our life to be different. But this is saying something very opposite, that we need to renounce something, that we need to step out of something to get that different perspective, to become a different way. And these qualities that can come from this, right, could be um, a better sense of concentration, could be a better sense of calm, could be a better sense of confidence, could be a better perceptibility of things that aren't good for you, of when you're taking things too far. And one of these very notable, right, is the indifference of notoriety, to not need to be known, to not need to be understood in the way, you know, to not chase people for validation is another thing that can be gained from certain renunciations. And also a straightforwardness. So all of these, you know, you'd think that there's some mystic thing here, you know, like full realization of God, right? Or something with a little more esoteric twang to it, you know. But all these are improving statements of personal beingness, of characteristics. And why wouldn't somebody want that? To become a better person by certain choice actions. Because the opposite of that, you know, things to be avoided and things of which would make somebody choose a path of renunciation or choose actions of renunciation to keep yourself in check is things like, you know, again, seeking validation, chronic validation from somebody, from other people, needing reputation, needing fame. What's up with that? To be involved in too many things. To be a brat. I mean, what's a brat? A brat is somebody who isn't disciplined, who expects anything they want to appear whenever they say so, right? Is there a little brattiness in you? Just a little bit? Just a little? Maybe a little? And to be inconsiderate is something else. I mean, you know, how can you help cultivate considerateness in somebody who exercises being inconsiderate, right? These would be what the renunciations point towards. So a commentary here. Modern consumerism, right? Instant gratification. What does this do? If we can't appreciate anything and we can just take, right? And we don't know what it is to not have, or even simply to just be apathetic about the having. You know, you're only a minimalist based off of who you're surrounded by, right? I mean, I don't want to go down that road. Okay. Something I've been hinting at is this discussion between hedonism and asceticism, right? And when most people hear hedonism, they think of something called folk hedonism, which is I will seek pleasure whenever it presents itself to me. And this has a lot to do with like that bro culture, that Chad, like fraternity life, right? Like if it's there, I'm going to get it. We're going to drink as much as possible. I'm going to get with whatever ladies I can, you know, maximum pleasure all the time, high octane living, go to the club, right? That is folk hedonism. However, hedonism as a philosophy is more long-term oriented. So A regular folk hedonistic argument would be, if doing drugs, if hooking up, if these things are there, then you go for it because it's pleasure. However, the true philosophy here would be to say that, doing drugs in such a variety, hooking up in such a quantity, right? Doing these things too much is unhealthy and will be unhealthy via venereal diseases, via the toxification of your body, through drugs, what have you, right? And that too much of this is in fact not hedonistic by its original philosophy because it's long-term oriented. So in this holistic hedonism, it would be, there's no shame in living it up every once in a while. But that's the trick, is every once in a while. And if you're dependent on these things and you got to do it every day and with voracious quantity, right? That is not the way. Versus on the other side, asceticism, right? To do none of these things. And into the extreme end, never, right? Complete celibacy. Never touch my body with that, with any of that, right? Never going to the club. Keeping myself out of all that, right? Preserving. That, as it's been shown, is also toxic. So what I want to stay here, and again, don't take my word for it. I'm just some dude, but it would seem to be to say that moderation is the true way here. And I know that seems really obvious, but it's what's preached within Buddhism on a religious level. We've seen where it's gone wrong in self-mummification and self-flagellating in like just judgment, just a lot of judgment, And it's not to say that you should not live life, but it's also not to say that you should live life. I know that sounds really weird. Somebody might judge you for the things that you do and that you do it too much. And then somebody else would judge you that you never do things enough. And they both have a point. And so it's that terribly, terribly fine line, right? If you were to take it to its extreme, then you could see certain parts of the cult of Dionysus just throwing themselves in the throes of ecstasy, right? In like bestial nature and just being absolutely lit, drinking wine stuffed with hallucinogens and whatever, and turning into a naked animal far out in the woods. I mean, that's the other end, right? I mean, and there's other traditions too where there's this great purging of that desire, and there's something to be said of that. There is a spiritual experience within that too, of letting go, of letting loose, of doing the dervish, So there's a spirituality to be gained in the full openness, in the full taking on of the sensuous experience of life. And there is a spirituality to be taken from the full inward in the renunciation of life. And they both have fruit to bear. But the beauty of life is balance and symmetry, and to seek that instead, right? Anyhow, hop off my soapbox. Aestheticism can be seen throughout these traditions and can always be used as a measuring stick of different religions, of how much it's practiced, of how little it's practiced, of what priority it's held. And so I hope this session helps illuminate this thread that connects various spiritual traditions, its pitfalls and its benefits.